friends, I am Rob, or Omnisci, or the Dungeon Tutor, wherever you find me. Today, I am on day 3 of RPGaDay 2022, which means that I have a new and fun question to answer, again with the purpose of putting out positive content to inspire people and entertain and all those other good things that RPGaDay is supposed to promote. So, today's question is, when were you first introduced to RPGs? Now, it's a little complicated because my very first encounter with a role-playing game was a Dungeons & Dragons box set that my parents were given, I think for an anniversary gift, by an aunt and uncle of mine. It's safe to say they had no idea what they were getting, my parents. Probably because my mom liked fantasy literature a bit. I mean, she's the one who introduced me to The Hobbit, J.R. Tolkien stuff. She loved Dragon Riders of Pern, so there were, fantasy influences in her life, and that's possibly why they gave them a D&D box set. I don't remember if it was Moldvay or Holmes, but it was one of those two. It was the basic set. And as an 8-year-old boy, when I first saw this, I was excited. It really fired my imagination. I read through the monster section of it and just thought about all those cool creatures. But I was 8, and my parents had never read it. They weren't interested in it. If they bought it as a board game, it's not that. So, yeah, my parents weren't going to do anything with it. So I read it a bunch, but I was 8. And I had no other influences, nobody I could talk to, nobody I could certainly play it with. I thought the dice were really cool, but those were probably like the old powder blue that you had to use a crayon for, which was awesome. But I didn't have anybody to play with, so it really wasn't that much of an introduction. And I couldn't get my head around a lot of the abbreviations and things for everything. There were so many XPs and GPs and EPs and PPs. Haha. Also, their overuse of the word level confused me quite a bit. I mean, you could be a 9th level fighter, 9th level magic user casting a 4th level spell on the 3rd floor of the dungeon against a level 6 demon. Yeah, that's... pull out a thesaurus, Gary. Come on. Or, in this case, Mr. Moldvay or Mr. Holmes. But that's kind of the thing. It really wasn't that intuitive. Even those box sets that were supposed to be easier than basic than original Dungeons and Dragons or advanced Dungeons and Dragons were still pretty impenetrable. I would have liked to have had a chance against the red box Beckme set back then, the Frank Menser series, because I think I would have had a much better shot with that. It was much better explained for a younger audience, like I was. Even though I consider myself to be quite clever and bright for my age, I just couldn't see it as a game for what it was. So, that was an introduction of sorts, but hardly a good one, and not a very lasting one, although I do, at this point, really mourn the loss of that box set. It vanished in several moves. I really can't remember the last time I even saw it. I think it was shortly before my family moved down south. We spent a year and a half down in Missouri, so boy, that was a culture shock considering I came from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I'll tell you that. But anyhow, autobiography aside, the first time I really got introduced to Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games was the summer of going into my freshman year. I made a friend, and we were both kind of outcast in our own school. We didn't have large circles of friends. We were kind of geeks, basically. And he went off to a different school in our freshman year. He went to a seminary, which, as I speak right now, is about 15 miles away from where I'm sitting. This becomes important because, I went through my freshman year of high school. Okay. But I heard back from my friend, who came back and visited a few times and everything, and told me excitedly about all these friends that he had made at the seminary and all the games he was interested in now. Which sounded pretty cool. And he taught me, we talked about, role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. So during my freshman year, I actually got the red box Dungeons and Dragons set. Boy, did I read through that a ton. I absorbed that material. If I showed it to you right now, it's quite shredded. I show it a couple of times in some of my other videos, but I hate to handle it too much because it literally is falling to pieces. I devoured all of that, and then I fell in with a group, again in my freshman year of high school, that played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Once I made it known that I was interested in Dungeons and Dragons, they invited me to play with them. This was a lot better than trying to get my brothers to play Dungeons and Dragons with me. They didn't have the patience for it. Can't blame them entirely. It's just not what they were into. So I couldn't get them to do it. Except, well, I mean, occasionally I tried strong-arming them into playing a little bit here and there, but yeah, it didn't work. But then I fell in with this other group, and I started playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm not going to say that it was the easiest transition in the world, even though I was a freshman in high school. There's a lot of abstract concepts in there, and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is as advertised. It is advanced considerably over Dungeons & Dragons. But I learned a lot from that group. I learned that you can play with a fairly narrative style, even in Dungeons & Dragons, where you don't have to have a battle mat all the time and miniatures, and it wasn't necessarily always about the tactical combats and things. Sometimes it was about looking cool and telling a story through a combat or an encounter or an exchange. And that helped really to change how I learned to play. So that was a better introduction overall by actually getting to play with a group, which was awesome. I still have fond memories of that group. My very first character I can consider that I have, I still own that character. It's in a box behind me. And, it was a cleric that I was handed because they needed a healer. And, again, I came into this with no preconceived notions. Because up in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, we were a bit removed from the Satanic Panic thing. There were some stirrings from the ultra-religious, but not a lot. And it was kind of neutral at this point. And, some kids were playing it. But my first character was a cleric that I was handed. It's like, hey, we need a healer. Here, you're a cleric. Tell me how many people out there had the same experience getting into role-playing games, because that's pretty common. But I learned to play. I played an ultra-good character who just didn't know he could do anything other than be super lily-white good. And, I had quite a few adventures. We went through several modules of Dungeons and Dragons and AD&D. And they were fine. They were good. I made new friends. I got to have several memorable moments where I learned some really good lessons about role playing. But even that was sips. Those several sessions, those months that I played with that character, those were sips. The sophomore year, I followed my friend to the seminary. Went there for a full year. And that was the baptism. In a sense. Not only following him, but taking on several of his friends as my own friends, which was really good because he left the seminary early on in the year, so I was by myself in a sense. But these guys that I got to know through role-playing games, we became a really tightly knit group. As a matter of fact, the friend that I made there, who I consider my best friend even to this day, was best man at my wedding and everything, he still plays at the table with me every week, which is pretty damn awesome, I'll say that. And couldn't be happier having him. He's a great role player, great friend. And through all of that, playing sometimes on a Sunday, we would get up, have breakfast, start playing, go to lunch, keep playing, go to supper, keep playing, all the way up till curfew. You'd have a 12-hour day of gaming. I can't even contemplate that anymore. But yeah, we did that. And then on a weekday, we would go to school, do all the stuff we had to do, get into talk about the game, get into the game, maybe try a different game. And one of the cool things about that seminary was that there were all these corridors and technically Dungeons and Dragons was not encouraged, I found out. Boy, did I find that out. But it wasn't encouraged to the point where we kind of hit it. The proctor of our dormitory was pretty chill. He didn't mind us doing that. As long as we didn't break curfew, we didn't break any rules, he was fine. I think he understood that it was just nonsense, the whole Satanic Pact thing. But it wasn't something that we could advertise, so we hid our games. But we didn't always just play in a dorm, especially if you were playing with people from other classes. You couldn't all be in the same dorm because they were off limits to people who weren't in your class. That was kind of a hard rule. It felt wrong to have a junior come into the sophomore dorms. It felt weird if you saw a freshman trying to come in and sneak into our dorms. It just didn't work right. So we had lots of neutral places. The beautiful thing is the seminary is on top of this big hill. It's got all these grand old buildings, and there's any number of nooks and crannies after hours that you can tell some awesome stories with great atmosphere. And, of course, there's the titillation that it's supposedly haunted. Now, I'm a skeptic. Just get that right out there. But even in my own skeptic mind, some things just felt odd. Playing in the main building of the seminary that supposedly a friar had committed suicide in, and supposedly his ghost would walk around, added more than just the suspense of getting caught. We'll just leave it at that. But there were some other places, maybe not the most comfortable places to play, but we'd still do it because, playing out in front of the auditorium, there's this nice hall with lighting that lift big pools of shadow and light, and it was just kind of cool to be in there. For only the most daring would dare to go play it up in the astronomy tower, though. That was... only got up there once. That would have been really cool, but boy, uncomfortable. Those stairs had no give. It would have been even better if we could have gotten up on top of the tower, but I don't know anybody who ever had keys for that I could have used to do such. So that was my real introduction to role-playing games. Being the full-time game master, I got a reputation pretty quickly as telling a pretty good story. Just with the back-me set of rules. By that time I had the basic and advanced set, and I got the companion set partway through the year, because our game was starting to go that far. It would have been pretty cool to have had another year or two and keep going with that campaign. It would have been epic. But it wasn't meant to be. I was asked not to return after my sophomore year. A variety of things. I can't help but think the Satanic Pact had a bit of a significant impact to that, but there were personal failings that led to it, I will confess. Wasn't exactly the most outgoing and social person. I could never even have imagined having some sort of a video cast back in the day. I never would have thought of putting myself out in front of people like that. But when I was telling a story and role-playing, that was different. And honestly, it really did help me when I got to college, opening up enough that I could actually not only come up with the idea of stomaching being on stage and doing a live performance, but eventually loving that and thriving in that. Really became a big part of my life back then too. And really, isn't that just an offshoot of role-playing? Developing a character and being that character for a little while, strutting your time on the stage? I think so. But that is what I would consider my introduction to gaming. Obviously, it's evolved many times since then. My college years especially were an absolute just catalyst for the development of my evolution as I came across different styles, different games. I got this hunger and thirst for all these different games that I have many of them right now in my library. I've worked hard to find some of those that I really wanted to play, but doesn't get away from the fact that it had to start somewhere, way back in the hands of an 8-year-old boy who had the Dungeons and Dragons box set, which slipped through my fingers as I didn't really comprehend what I had, and then picked up several years later when I was in high school. So, that's my story. If you yourself are a gamer, what's your story? Either, I would challenge you, make a video like this, explain this, because, you know, people might be interested. I know there's a lot of people out there right now who are getting into role-playing games, and they'd love to hear how other people got into this hobby. It comes up every once in a while on social media, and this is my definitive story about how I came into role-playing games. Consider that that journey has brought me some of the best friends I've ever had in my life, the chance to get my own work published. Yeah, it's been a great ride, so I don't regret that at all. And I thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to me ramble about my life. Hopefully you got something out of it and enjoyed it. Maybe it'll inspire you to add something to it. At the very least, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear stuff like that. I know I certainly do. You know, obviously, we all have our own stories. If you've been in games, there's stories. There are horror stories and there are glorious stories. And I'd always like to be the person to hear that if you want to tell someone else. So, I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, or Omnisci, whichever you prefer, and thank you for joining me on this little ramble. Until the next video, hopefully tomorrow, we'll see you then. Until then, farewell.